Hello, my name is Jeff Adonisio, and this is the SIP 409 final presentation for Shadowcast. So, as I started first thinking about this game and this project, I was thinking back to the early days of how I first fell in love with collectible card games. I started playing Magic back in the very early years of 4th edition. Um, Still enjoy playing in Magic Arena today, and many other card games over the years. Hearthstone, Yu-Gi-Oh, Pokemon, all of these, the Legend of the Five Rings, all of these different card games. And one thing that I found that was consistent, um, is that when I'm playing these games, I'm imagining what's happening in the game, right? I'm imagining my bear coming through the woods and mauling someone, or my vampire flying across the board and consuming some other creature. I'm not thinking about it in terms of a card just moving over and attacking. And so I started thinking, how do we continue on that fantasy? And when that idea hit my head, then it started to get me into this idea of, well, what do we love about digital card games today as we're transitioning into the digital space? What are things that we love? Well, build craft is a main component of card games, right? We want to craft an idea. We want to come up with a weird mechanic that we can find in our heads and try to build a deck around this idea and try to carry that forward into a competitive format, playing against another player and see how our idea actually holds up, right? But as we're seeing a lot of these games transition, we're seeing into the transition of the digital space. We're seeing that they're adding a lot of animations, like Hearthstone. We see this a lot in, and Magic as well. In this example here, we see this this worm busting out of the ground, and we're starting that fantasy of like, how do we animate these cards? How do we bring this to life in a 3D space? Because we can do that in video games. It's one of the areas that provides us that opportunity, right? But why should the come to life fantasy end there? Why should it only be part of the intro of the card? And so that got me started to think about, how can we improve on this fantasy? Excuse me. And one of the other elements of, like, if we improve on this fantasy by allowing our 2D cards to become 3D objects on the board, we introduce this idea of positional impact on the game. Um, Different values for hitting someone from behind or a flank or in front. We have a new option to how we plan out our strategy and what makes that more interesting. And then I thought, how do we take this a little bit farther? And what if we could capture opponents' pieces? Instead of defeating them, what if we captured them onto our side when we're playing the game? So if that sounds interesting, let's continue on our talk through Shadowcast. What is Shadowcast at its core? Shadowcast is a card to 3D tactics game. So, what does this really mean? In Shadowcast, you're going to select a champion and you're going to build a deck which corresponds to those champions' core skills. And with a wide variety of champions, the different themes that you can build decks around are, in a large variance. Each turn, you're going to gather a white light resource that you can spend to play cards from your hand and summon them into a 3D space around your champion. So this will allow you to start creating your board control. Now, once you defeat an opponent's unit, you're going to gather a dark light resource, and you're going to capture that opponent's unit, which will allow you to summon it by spending that dark light resource and playing it onto the battlefield on your side of the board. So we have a constant tug of war battle going of summoning our opponent's creatures, but we're also spending the dark light and the white light for that balance, which introduces us to the eclipse attack, right? So the balance of our white light and dark light trigger an eclipse attack. Every champion in the game has a signature attack, and that ties into our eclipse mechanic. As we balance out our light and dark, we have two competing resources. As we balance them out, and when they are equal, we can release a super attack. And this will vary depending upon the champion that you have selected and the amount of resource you have. So for example, if you have one light resource and one dark light resource, you could release a super attack, but it's going to be on the weaker side of the scale. If you had 6 white light and 6 dark light, you would release on a super attack on the higher end of the scale. And this introduces an interesting risk versus reward mechanic. Is it better to, based on the position that you're in and the super attack that your particular champion has, is it more beneficial for you to store up your your resources to release a bigger attack? Or is it more valuable to go for board control by spending your resources to summon more things on the board, depending upon what your position is? So how is this different from other games? So Shadowcast combines the following concepts into a cohesive design to create a uniquely innovative card to 3D tactics game. Um, Buildcraft and positional strategy become the third player of the game. So how you're building your deck, the plan that you're going into the game with, and then being able to leverage that in a positional manner around the board really becomes the third player. This is a 1v1 player game where you're playing against another opponent, but the idea of how you're setting yourself up, where you're positioning yourself, and how you're bringing things into the game really becomes that third element. Leveraging of two different resources creates a system of risk versus reward of how do we want to use our energy. Again, it is the conversation of, is it board control or is it using the super attack? And that's going to vary based on the champion that you have, the build that you brought in with the particular deck, and where you're actually set up on the board. So multiple different layers to how and when you should use different abilities. And then the capturing of your enemy pieces to use for your own forces. This is something we see in a limited element to some games. For example, in Magic, you can capture different opponents' cards, and you can use them. If you're playing against a blue player, you may think that it's a possibility that this could happen, but it's not built into the core mechanic of the game. So you don't really plan for it as much as you just assume that it's possibly something that could happen. In Shadowcast, it's part of the built-in mechanic of the game, which means it's always going to happen, and thus allows you to put more thought into your build craft when you're crafting your decks to compensate for that. Now, obviously, keep in mind you will also be getting your opponent's creatures on your side, but it does add a variance of how do you want to plan throughout the course of the game. Who is this game for? Our target demographic is going to be deck builders and people who love tactics and strategy games. But I do think that the Eclipse mechanic itself, the balancing of two resources to unleash a super attack or to spend in other ways, can be tweaked to use in roguelike games or any other type of tactics game. Turn-based is more preferable, but it certainly could be used in an action with a pause mechanic to allow you time to plan. So for our prior art, Duelist was one of the first games that I've ever seen. It was the only game, to be honest, I've ever seen do a 2D card to 3D space game. It was created in 2016 by a company called Counterplay Games. Unfortunately, Duelist was shut down in 2020, and we haven't seen anything like this idea since. Duelist did not have an Eclipse mechanic where you're balancing multiple resources, and it did not have the ability to take control of other players' cards as a regular core mechanic of the game. So we are still different in that element, but leveraging on that same user base that really enjoyed Duelist. Auto Chess is another game that would be a distant relative, and as well the distant relatives of Auto Chess, like Dota Underworlds and the League of Legends Tactics game. The big difference here is that in Auto Chess and its relatives, you don't get direct control over your units. You set your pieces up on the board, and then you launch the fight, and it's an automated round. So you don't get to you don't have the level of control that you would in Shadowcast to determine how you're going to move and what the position will be. You also don't have as much control. You don't have a super attack at all. It's just the way the characters are automatically automated playing out. And then shogi, which is a Japanese version of chess. So when I was originally concepting this idea, I was doing research on games that allow for the capturing of other pieces, and shogi came up. And I had never heard of it previous to that time. But in shogi, you can capture your opponent's pieces and play them against one another, which I thought was very interesting. Other than that, it is not similar to Shadowcast. It is a chess game. There's a variation of American chess, I should say. So in closing, Shadowcast is a card to 3D tactics game at its core. It introduces a new genre of tactics game by allowing the capturing of opponents' pieces to be played against them as part of the core mechanic of the game, introducing positioning into a card game so that your position on the board is a major part of how your game is going to develop. And then the risk versus reward gameplay style of the balancing of two resources to launch a super attack or go for board control. And that is the final presentation. I have hoped that you've enjoyed this, and thank you for your time.